Marie, thank you so much for coming today. So tell us a little bit about what life was growing up as little Marie and what life was like and your understanding of God.
I grew up in rural Lancaster County, farmland surrounded where I lived. And, I loved that idyllic countryside and just the peaceful existence of life. And I went to church every week with my family. I grew up in a home that knew the Lord. And I think, I really wanted to continue to know him growing up and to find him in deep ways, in real places of my existence. And just kind of was on my own journey of finding him, and understanding who he had created me to be and what happened with all of those dreams inside of my heart. I think the overriding theme for me growing up was that I wanted to be a wife and a mom. There was a very brief time in elementary school when I thought about being an astronaut, but that was fairly short-lived. And I just dreamt of the day that I would be a wife and have my own home and have my own children, and we would have this wonderful family. And, I spent a lot of time thinking about that, being a daydreamer throughout my childhood and wondering how God would work all of that out. And, there were times that I was sure that wouldn't ever happen, and then it did. And I met Charlie when I was in high school. We met at church. Both of our families went there. And, after we got married, it was kind of like check mark number one off the list. Here I am, a wife. And it wasn't too long after until we found out that we were going to have a baby and thought, okay, check one, check two. I'm working on this list of all the things that are really passionate inside of my heart. And, just kind of entering into that season of understanding, the release of the dreams that God had placed within me and the hope that brings and the excitement that brings. And, for me, as a first-time mom, I never thought that we wouldn't come home from the hospital with our baby. I just expected that at the end of 9 months we would have this child and bring it home with us, and that's not the way it went. We lost our daughter at 26 weeks of pregnancy. She was born premature and lived for about 20 minutes. And that was my first taste of real intense personal tragedy, and just such a marker in my life for finding the Lord in a new way, in a deeper way than anything I had ever thought before. While I wanted to find him before, now I needed him, like I had never known a need prior to that. And, it's easy to look across my life now and see the places where God intersected me, and changed a little bit about what I thought life might be, but brought in his love and his hope beyond those moments.
Wow. So you grew up with kind of this beautiful, innocent, and then that happened, and then you did have 3 more children together.
Yes.
And as they're growing up, and then there came this dark moment in October of 2006. Can you walk us through some of your emotions of that day?
Charlie and I had 3 children by that point. They were 7, 5, and a year and a half. And it wasn't like life was perfect. There were a lot of struggles, common to everyone. But in some way, I was living my dream. And I couldn't have been more unprepared for the things that would happen that day. Charlie did walk with us to the bus stop that morning and kissed the kids and told them he loved them. And we never thought that was our goodbye. But when he called me later that morning and said, "I'm not coming home," it was a phrase that I had never heard, and it was the sound of his voice in a way I hadn't heard in almost 10 years of marriage, that I knew I would never see him again. I certainly didn't know what he planned to do and didn't know that it would involve other people, much less children, but I knew that everything that I thought to be true about my life was changing, and all the security and the stability that I had found, from our family and from him as a provider was over. And in that moment, my heart just really cried out to the Lord. In those early moments, I didn't know what was happening. I didn't know all the tragedy that was going on, but I knew that my life and the lives of my children were never going to be the same. And so I was just crying out to the Lord and, kind of seeing that movie reel replay of my life before my eyes, and reminding myself of those markers of times with the Lord and the way that he walked me through the loss of our first daughter and the way that he brought hope and peace and helped me to be content and okay. And so I could, even in that first moment, look back upon everything I knew to be true about God at the same time that everything I knew to be true about life was crumbling.
So you are faced with this insurmountable tragedy, and then you have kind of a choice that many of us have when tragedy strikes. It's either God is kind of this cosmic killjoy who wants nothing to do with us, or he's something else. And you talk about in your book, and I've heard you before, about the two choices. Talk us through those and how you made the one that you did.
You know, in that afternoon, I knew that I had to make a choice about what I was going to believe for my life. And I didn't want this to be the day that my kids looked back on and said that, our lives were over. And, I felt like the enemy thought he won in the schoolhouse and that he had won over Charlie and won over so many things that day. But I declared inside my heart that he was not going to win over our family, that we wouldn't be victims from this, but that God would help us to be victorious in spite of all of the circumstances. And I knew that I had to make a choice, that my perspective would directly influence not just my life, but the lives of my children. And as I thought about, the choices that lay before me, I knew that there were only two, and I had to make one of them. I could either choose to believe that everything I had read in the pages of the Word, or felt the Lord speak to my heart, or heard others testify of him to be. I could choose to believe that all of that was true and that somehow he was going to come to rescue us. Or I could choose to believe that we were going down like the fastest sinking ship. And I could not fathom how he would rescue us, except to know that that's who he is. That all that I had read and experienced of the Lord, I know that he rescues us and that he's close to the brokenhearted. And I also was very aware that I couldn't do this on my own and that I had nothing. And so in that moment of desperation, I knew that not only did I have nothing, but I had nothing to lose by trusting the Lord. And so I just chose to believe that he had more for us than I could see in that moment, and that he had life beyond the death that I felt, and that he would bring something good and beautiful, not just for me, but for my kids, for our community, for all the others that had lost that day, that God would somehow redeem this in a way that we all could not comprehend. But my limited ability to understand the situation did not limit the way that God planned to intervene.
Wow. That choice is just so huge for us and for you. And you started to live that out, and you talk about in your book that later that night that you were going to go to Aunt Linda's and Uncle Jim's house, and you insisted on driving. So it was like one sentence in the book. I thought that was significant. So why was that a big deal for you in that moment?
I wanted, as much as I had lost control of so many things, to still have control over some of the aspects of my life, and to be, a mom that wasn't just weak and had those moments of weakness and all of this, but to also show my kids strength. I wanted them to be able to come through this with strength as well. And I knew that I needed to continue to do all the things that I would do before. And I felt such boldness and courage and strength from the Lord to do it that was way outside of who I was, on my own. And so when we were talking about going to my aunt and uncle's that night, I said, I'll drive my car. And of course everybody was trying to convince me to let my dad drive, and I said, no, he can ride with me, but I'm going to drive the car. It's something that I would have done anyway. And I felt the courage from the Lord to do that. I think even in the first hours after everything had happened, and in especially the week that followed, God just did something really incredible inside of my heart that I wouldn't have anticipated. And while I grew up being very self-conscious and not having a lot of self-confidence, the Lord really came and shifted all of that. And in those first days, I walked with such a more confident and purposeful step because I was understanding who God said I was in the midst of it, that I wasn't just defined by everything that had happened, but that the definition of my existence is his love. And he was not limited in the way he saw me by the tragedy that had happened, but that he still had, a lot in store for me and for my family. And it gave me courage to walk out all of those places.
Wow. So instead of choosing kind of a victim mentality, you decided to walk with the purpose of God, him carry you through. And that changed the trajectory of your life, it seems. So there were some, obviously, you had to communicate to your children, and you also, at this kind of in that same frame, saw some things from the Amish community, not only that day, but then again you've got a funeral that you have to be at for Charlie. And so tell us about some of those scenes that you saw and what you learned about God through those things.
As I think back on that week, there are so many places that really stand out to me. And one of the first ones was that afternoon when I was preparing to tell my kids. They were in the backyard. We were at my parents' house, and they were laughing, and I could hear them. And I just was soaking in that, thinking, God, I don't want this to be the last time that I hear their laughter. And, I knew that they needed to know everything. They couldn't go back to school and have the potential to hear things on the playground that they would want to think were false when they could actually be true. But I knew that they didn't need to know all the details right away, that it was so hard for my heart to comprehend everything, and how much harder would it be for them. And so, I called them in that afternoon, just feeling the burden of that moment and thinking of all the conversations I ever thought would be hard to have as a mom. This exceeds every one of them. And God, how will we get through this? What will life look like on the other side of this moment? And I simply said to them, with them sitting on either side and my youngest on my lap, today your dad made some very bad choices. And some people were hurt, and some people died, and he died too. And in the silence of that space and in all of our sorrow, I was just crying out to the Lord saying, God, you've got to fix this. I can't fix this, but you have to fix it. And I felt him reassure me that he wasn't going to fix it, but he was going to redeem it. And it's been something that I've thought about a lot in the years since, and just the way that so much of the time there are places in our lives that we can't fix. Sometimes we're living out the choices that someone else made that weren't good. Or maybe we're living out life that's a result of choices that we made coming from not the best place. And sometimes we can't fix it, but nothing's beyond the redemption of the Lord. And it gave me hope beyond that moment that God would redeem what had happened, and not just in my heart, but in the hearts of my children and in other people around us. And that was something that has stuck with me so powerfully in the years since, just continuing to ask the Lord when I'm faced with a difficult situation, whether how big or small it seems, just to invite his redemption over it. That I don't have to bear the weight of trying to fix it all. I need to allow his grace and his redemption to come in. Other places where I saw the Lord move so powerfully that week, and even that very first day, within a few hours after the tragedy taking place, I was at my parents' house. It was after the conversation with the kids, and I was standing in their kitchen looking out the window, and I saw some Amish men walking down the street, and I knew they were coming to my parents' house. This was a very tight-knit community. We knew each other, and I said to my mom and dad, I don't know what to do. I don't know what to say. There had been such a small amount of time, and I was doing so much responding in those few hours, responding to the police, responding to my family, responding to my children. I hadn't had time to sit down in a quiet place and just think about all of the things like, what will it be like the first time that I meet the families, and what on earth can I possibly say to them? There are no words capable of expressing what I feel inside for their families, but I hadn't had that space and time to think about that or to agonize over it. And my dad said, it's okay, you stay inside and I'll go out and talk with them. And I continued to watch from the window. I could not hear what they were saying, but I could see the exchange that was happening. I saw them put their hands on his shoulder and put their arms around him. And I could see the compassion. And when he came back inside, we all waited as he collected himself from the emotion of that moment. And he said, Marie, they came because they want you to know that they're concerned about you and they're concerned about the children. They wanted you to know that they've forgiven Charlie and they're extending grace and compassion over your family. And, I really believe that in that moment, God freed me through their quick response from feeling the weight of giving an account for Charlie's choices. And it ushered me into just a place of finding the healing of the Lord for our family. As the week wore on, there were so many emotional moments, things that I had to do, choices that I couldn't do them if I wanted to. I had to do them. So many things that felt way beyond me, but the Lord gave me strength for all of them. And I remember thinking, okay, Saturday is the funeral. If we can just get through Saturday, then at least that will be out of the way. And I don't know how hard the rest of life is going to be, but it can't be any worse than going to the funeral. As we were driving to the cemetery, I saw, as we got close to the church, there was a line of media across the street, and they had big cameras that looked like telescopes. And I was crying out to the Lord, saying, God, you've got to do something. I don't want the world looking on in this so private moment of grief. I had worked so hard that week to keep our faces out of the media. I did not want my kids, my family, my community exposed like that. And as we turned the corner and pulled into the parking lot, I saw a group of Amish people walking towards us, just one by one in single file line. And as our cars came through the parking lot, they formed a wall on the other side of us so that all that could be seen from the streets were their backs. And it wasn't like they came that day thinking, oh, we're going to protect Marie and her family from the media, but they came to show their support and to show us their love, and they allowed the Lord to do something even larger with it than any of us could have imagined. And it was such an incredible gift for me to know that I didn't have to worry about the pictures and the media. We could just be there in the sorrow of that place. And then afterwards, we talked with each other and, exchanged life, exchanged sorrow, and talked about our brokenness. But one of the things that astonished me in that moment and in the days and weeks that followed was the way that the Amish families were able to speak to my heart and to understand the agony that I faced, and to say, I see your pain in a very real way. I knew a lot about their culture just from growing up there, but I had never experienced their love and their compassion the way that I did, in that week and in the time since. And one of the things that I love so much about them and I've come to appreciate so tremendously is just the way that they say what's on their hearts. They don't hold back. And I just believe that is so foundational, that they brought healing because they were able to speak to my pain.
Wow. Beautiful pictures of just the love of God displayed through community and what they did.
Yeah.
And I know that you share in your book that week and even the days and the months and years that have followed, people have said, Marie, wow, you are so strong. How do you process that? How do you make sense of all of that?
I think it's easy to look at someone's circumstances and say, wow, they're really strong, or, to make some kind of generality based on what you think their life is like. And I always say, I am not strong. It's God who's strong, and he's the one that gives me strength to face all of this. If it was up to me, I would probably run the other direction. I know that's not where life is, and I want what God has so much, and I felt his courage and his promise inside my heart so strongly that I was willing to walk through it if it meant that was going to take me closer to him. I think a lot of times when we go through tragedy, we find the Lord in ways that we never would have known him otherwise. And it's not that it makes all of the pain okay, but it's the promise that we're going to see the goodness of the Lord in a way that our eyes wouldn't have been able to see otherwise. And it's not that I love pain, I certainly don't, but I know that he's got something really beautiful in that moment if I'll allow him to reveal it to me. But he's the one that makes me strong. In Nehemiah it says, the joy of the Lord is our strength. And I don't think I ever really understood that verse. We hear it all the time, but I didn't understand it until I had no joy and I had no strength. But to find that God could give me strength through his joy, and that we could have joy in those moments that seemed so destroyed was totally the Lord.
Wow. A lot of people kind of look at life, and some people would ask, if I'm just having a hard time believing that God is so good when there's so much bad that happens. So if someone were to say that to you, I just have a hard time believing that God is so good when such evil or such darkness happens in their own life or the world around us. How do you respond to that kind of statement?
For me in my life, and even as I've thought about all the places of pain and the loss that I've experienced, this is what I've come to know. I think our hearts really want some solid answers to questions that we just can't get a solid answer to. But I know that my circumstances are not an indication of God's love for me or my perceived lack of love, but that my circumstances show me that God will come to exactly where I am and walk with me on the road out. And we have to look for him. I was very aware, even in those first days, that my perspective would greatly influence my reality. Whatever I was capable of seeing would be all I saw. So if God wanted to do amazing things for my family, but I didn't think he could, if I wanted to put him in a box somewhere and believe that he wasn't capable of making something beautiful, I would not see the beauty, even if it happened. But if I was willing to say, okay, God, you are capable of more than I can imagine, there is the potential for me to see beauty in that I would have missed otherwise. And so I think it's just about, allowing the Lord to lift our heads so that our perspective isn't so focused on what's right in front of us, but that we ask him to give us the way he sees, to give us his eyes for our situation or our lives, and to look for the goodness of the Lord in the midst of it. Early on, I would talk to my kids about going on a treasure hunt. I really felt the Lord impressing this upon my heart, that even in the midst of all these really bad things, that there were glimmers of the goodness of God, and we could find him if we were willing to look for him. In January, just a few months after everything had happened with Charlie, our dog was hit by a car, and I was devastated. It was like, another loss so close on the heels of that first loss, and just thinking how would the kids respond to it. And someone brought us the very next day a basket that had 3 stuffed puppy dogs in it. They didn't know what had happened, and it just was a beautiful reminder to me that God knew, and he was providing something, for us to hold, for the kids to hold in the midst of that loss. And it was another marker of one of those treasure hunts, of just seeing the goodness of the Lord, even though we were faced with another really difficult situation. It didn't take away the pain, but it's knowing that God sees the pain, that he was prepared in advance to meet our need. And that's who he is, that our circumstances don't indicate his love, but that he loves us enough to walk with us through them.
Wow. There's a lot of times where I think in life that we kind of do problem comparison, where, my problem is as bad as theirs, and we kind of shrink back, and other times where my problem is way worse. But what's big for us in that moment is huge for us in that moment. And so what advice would you give to someone who's experiencing some kind of heartache right now? Maybe it's a loss of a child or the loss of a parent. Maybe there's a divorce and the children are kind of wondering, okay, where is God in the midst of something I had nothing to do with? God, where are you in this? Others that have children that are going through heartache or difficult times. So what advice would you give to us about how do you make it through those kind of dark places?
I think for me, one of the things that I've felt the Lord reminding me of frequently is that, he is with me in the valley, and he is with me on that climb up the mountain, but I can't stay there. I have to keep moving through it. And I think that this season between Thanksgiving and Christmas, if you're going through a difficult time, I feel like it really magnifies it, and the emotions are a lot more raw, and the pain is a lot more real, just because you have the balance of all of the emotions and thoughts about what Christmas is supposed to be like, and sometimes it just does not align at all with what your reality is. And I think it's just allowing yourself to be real with yourself, to be real with the Lord, and to say, this is the pain that I'm facing. For me, I've taken so much encouragement from the Psalms. David doesn't hold back. He tells God the way it is, exactly how he feels in his heart. And sometimes you can read that and think, wow, is that kind of arrogant? But it's not. God knows what we're thinking. It doesn't matter if we voice it or not. He knows. And so why hold back from him? Why not tell him what you're feeling? Because when we express it, it gives him the ability to help us through it. I think that it's allowing yourself to have the space to do that, recognizing that not only do you need the Lord, but you need relationship around you. You need people that can speak an encouraging word, that you can be real with, that you can be vulnerable with. Being vulnerable is a choice to say, hey, I'm having a really hard week. I know that I'm going to really be struggling till the end of the year because I'm dealing with this and it's so heavy on my heart. Would you pray for me? Would you check in with me and ask me how I'm doing? Not just the, hey, how are ya, passing through, but just saying to me, how are you doing with this? Are you doing okay? Because we can't stop in that place. We need to process it and we need to deal with the emotion, but we can't stop and stay there. We have to allow the Lord to lead us through. And This week I've really felt the Lord just encouraging me, even in some areas that I was feeling just great discouragement with, that the best way to overcome discouragement is to encourage someone else. And so even if you are going through a really difficult time, you can be the one that encourages someone else in their difficulty. And that isn't just a gift to them, but it becomes a gift to you. That God can use you in the midst of the pain that you're feeling to encourage someone else. And it's kind of like, speaking to your soul, to remind yourself, God is good and he loves me and he's getting me through this. That you invite the light in to banish the darkness, to believe the promises and the truths of God, and that pushes the darkness aside.
Wow. You talked about this prayer of when the tragedy really kind of culminated was, God, would you fix this? And then God seemingly replied to you, I'm not going to fix it, I'm going to redeem it. And so tell us a little bit about how God has redeemed that. The kids are getting older, you're not a single mom anymore, so talk to us a little bit about how God has redeemed this for you.
I met my husband that I have now, Dan, shortly after everything happened with the tragedy, and we got married less than 8 months after I lost Charlie, and I never would have thought that that was God's plan. And if I had been looking at someone else's life like this, I probably would have said, they're moving too fast, are they crazy? What is he thinking? And Dan and I went through all of those same things. When I first felt the Lord speaking to me about Dan, I spent 3 days arguing with God, telling him either he was speaking wrong or I was hearing wrong, but one of us had a problem. You could say it was fasting. I didn't eat or sleep, but really I was just arguing with the Lord. And, I'm thankful that God kept my heart after him and kept encouraging me to believe that, sometimes that God does really crazy things, but it answers the cry of our heart. At Christmas that year, my son, who was 5, had asked me to get him a new dad for Christmas. And I said, it's not like buying a box of cereal. You can't just pick one. So he starts going through his 5-year-old explanation of what it looks like to have a new dad. But it pierced my heart in a way to know this is what my kids need right now. Every kid needs a mom and a dad, and my kids needed a dad more then than ever before. And, I'm thankful for what God has done in my life with Dan and what he's done in my kids' lives with him, and for the way that he's blended our family together, that we can support one another. And we have a blended family of 5 children, ranging in age from my youngest, Carson, who's now 8, up to my stepdaughter, Nicole, who's 21 and in college. We have 3rd grade, 7th grade, 8th grade, 9th grade, and college. Sometimes I have to think about that for a minute. It's busy and chaotic, and there's always something going on, but I love it. I love what God has done in our family and the way that he's written this amazing story of redemption upon our lives. And, in the past couple years working on the book, it's allowed me to see my life in a different way, to step back from a wider perspective instead of being so up close, just to be able to take inventory of what God's done and how he's brought redemption, and to have the kids be excited about sharing the story of who the Lord is. And I'm excited to watch them grow, and I love it when I see them reaching out to someone in compassion, being able to identify with their struggles. And I'd want to say that my kids would have always been that compassionate, but I have to believe that God's deepened their level of compassion and understanding through what they've walked. And so I'm excited for their future and for what the Lord has for them, and just thankful for the way that God purposes so much more than we can see in the moment. He truly does more than we could ask, think, or imagine.
Wow. So tell us about the title of the book.
One Light Still Shines. When we were talking through the process of picking a title, I really wanted it to be something that could capture the essence of my whole story in just a couple words, but something that wouldn't just impact me, but also impact everyone who picked up the book. For me, it wasn't enough to just write the story. If I wasn't writing it in such a way that everyone who reads it would be impacted and develop their own personal relationship with God, then I didn't want to write it at all. And so, to say, one light still shines. Jesus is the light. His light will never be overshadowed. Darkness is not powerful enough to overshadow his light. And it's not just true for my life, but it's true for everyone's life, that it doesn't matter what darkness you're facing, there is always one light that still shines, and that's the love of God.
Wow, beautiful. And at the end, in the foyer, those books will be available. Maria would love to meet you and to spend some time with you. But I'd like us to now just kind of take a moment and just give some space